Hey everybody, my name is Jake and welcome back to the Learn with Hack the Box series here on this channel. In today's video, we're going to be talking about what a penetration test looks like, which is going to be really cool. But before we jump into that, I do want to mention that this is the third installation of the Red Team style content into this series, which means there's two videos before this, and I think it would be really beneficial for you to go and check those two out before you watch this one. Mainly because I talk about a couple different things in those videos in a lot more depth than I'm going to in this video, because I assume that you've already seen those. So please check those out before you watch this one. It will be more beneficial to you. And while you're over there, we actually have a parallel sub-series to this one running in the Learn with Hack the Box series by a fellow creator named Geo. He's doing the defensive style content, and I think that would be really awesome if you check that out as well if you're interested in the defensive side of cyber. Now, like I said, the topic of today's video is going to be what a penetration test looks like. That's a little bit of a lofty goal because the word pen testing has become synonymous with a number of different things, but really what I think most people are thinking about when they think of pen testing is network pen testing, and that's actually what we're going to be showcasing today. So the idea of a network pen test is that we start from an outside perspective on this network with very little information of the servers or machines in there, and we try to go from no information to complete compromise of a server in some way, shape, or form. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's go ahead and take a look at what a pen test looks like. Okay, so let's go ahead and start this penetration test off. So I do have a Hack the Box phone box pulled up, but any sort of VM where you can connect into the Hack the Box network works perfect. For this demonstration, I'm actually going to be using a machine called Appointment from the starting point list of machines, because this does have a great example of an easy service to kind of demonstrate how we're going to enumerate this information and then eventually exploit things. But like I just said, the goal here for this phase, or this enumeration phase, is to get as much information from this target as humanly imaginable. Now, I'm actually going to pull up a nifty little illustration that I made. You're gonna have to bear with my drawing skills here, but realistically, we're going to have our own little computer here. And now we're outside of this network that you're seeing. And inside of this network, all of these machines in this, this network can communicate. In this case, it's going to be this appointment machine, but we're realistically focused on that one machine. Now, the goal of the enumeration phase is to, make the ability to communicate with this one machine and take all of the information from this machine and see what we can glean from it. In this case, I'm going to demonstrate how this machine is going to have, a bunch of different ports, or different applications running on these different doors if you watched the Nmap video. But a little bit of a spoiler as I'm drawing here, realistically we're going to eventually see that this has a port open on port 80, which is going to be a web application. But I want to show you how we do that. So I'm going to kind of gloss over the details of this Nmap scan as I build it. If you're really interested in kind of building out, a methodology of how to, execute Nmap scans and understand them at a deeper level, that's what I covered in the last video. So I'm going to gloss over this a little bit, but ultimately Nmap is this quintessential tool in pen testing for basically trying to enumerate what types of avenues you have for attacking a machine. So to do that, we're basically just going to type Nmap. In this case, I'm going to do capital P, lowercase n. I'm going to quickly explain these as I go through this, but that's basically to skip the pinging of the host because I know it's live. And then I'm going to do dash lowercase s, capital V, capital C. That's basically just going to do some version and script enumeration on this target. Then I'm going to do a dash capital T with a number 1 through 5. In this case, I'm going to do 4 because I think it kind of gives us that balance of speed and accuracy. And then the only other thing that we need is the IP of our target. So in this case, I'm just going to grab our IP address and paste it in here really quick. Let's see. Paste it in. Awesome. And I have a couple of nastiness from not copying that correctly first. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to let this run, and then we can kind of recoup to go over the results of this. But realistically, this is going to be the start of our enumeration phase. Okay, so now that this Nmap scan has finished, we can go ahead and jump into what I consider the analysis phase. Now, the enumeration and the analysis phase kind of have this ping-pong relationship, I like to think, where you run some, enumeration, try to get some information, and then you move into this analysis portion of what can I do with this information? Is any of this meaningful? And you kind of go back and forth until you find an adequate avenue. The reason, again, that I chose this starting point machine is it doesn't, overwhelm any of us with too much information. There's really, one straightforward way to go through this, and I think it exemplifies that really well. So if you're interested in doing this yourself, this is the appointment box inside of the starting point in Tier 1. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at this Nmap scan. So realistically, we only have, one port open here. The service is HTTP. It looks like it's an Apache server, and it looks like the title of the page is a login page, which is super interesting. So what we want to do, or when I see this, is I want to pull up a browser and see if we can interact with this web application to see, what might be there. Now, it says it's a login page, so I would imagine there's some sort of login page, or the title is a login page. So I'm going to assume it's some sort of login functionality, maybe to some management application, or who knows, but there is a web server here. Now, if you don't know, like I said, the service is HTTP, so the way you are able to navigate to this resource or this web server inside of this network is http://. That basically tells the protocol in which you're going to try to request something from the address, and then the address. So we need to give it a IP address. So basically we're saying, hey, make an HTTP request to this IP address, which is the IP address of our target, and see what it returns to us. So we're going to go ahead and navigate there, and it looks like it does pull up a login page. Now, for basic analysis, I'm really just going ahead and taking a look. It doesn't look like we have, a whole lot, under the hood here. If I was to do a full analysis here, I would probably pull up the dev tools in the browser to see, what might exist inside the HTML, just to see like what the elements are on the page. Maybe there's something hidden in the source code, certain things you could type for, see if there's any admin credentials left over, see if there's any hidden elements. In this case, there's not. I'm just using that search functionality. So it looks like we're just kind of stuck at this login page. Now, we'll kind of skip some of the process of testing for web vulnerabilities in this next phase and show you what an exploitation of a web vulnerability that could ultimately lead to, server takeover might look like. But in terms of, a basic enumeration here, some other things that I might try is something called directory busting. So on a web server, you could have a bunch of different directories and files hosted. For example, a common one might be robots.txt, which basically just tells web crawlers what they are allowed and not allowed to kind of, crawl on your website or request from your website. So you could try and see if, there's robots.txt. Now, there is 1,000,001 different ways that you could attempt to do this for a web application. There's an infinite number of possibilities of different directories. A directory might look something like, let's just say, admin in this case. So let's do, it might be like admin, and then robots.txt might be a file within that directory, right? There's a million things that could happen here. There's no way to do this by hand. So you might be able to run something like directory busting, which basically just brute forces a bunch of different requests to this web server to see what is and is not present on the web application, which can be really beneficial. For the sake of brevity here, I'm not going to showcase going through all of that. We're really just going to be focusing on this login page and exploiting a vulnerability on this login page. But for the sake of, kind of analyzing what we do and we don't have, I might start testing some of these inputs. Now, the real root of the analysis and kind of enumeration here is to see how you can interact with the server. Now, again, a bunch of different ways you could potentially test things here, but realistically, the idea of this exploitation is that we're going to be sending data to the server. And I will jump into this in more detail while we transition into this exploitation phase. Okay, so now we're going to get into the juicy part of exploitation. So like I said, the core concept to remember here is we have a way now to send our, arbitrary input to the server, have the server process that in the form of this login page. So when I mentioned earlier in the video that there are a lot of different types of penetration tests, and we're focusing on a network penetration test here, one of those different types of penetration tests is a web application penetration test. And that means that this web application right here could literally constitute its own full penetration test. So I can't really go into the details for, the full process of identifying how, somebody would have originally, found this versus, one of the other types of vulnerabilities. We'll get into how this is exploited and identified briefly, but for the sake of this video not being 3.5 hours long, talking, in detail about web application penetration tests in general, we're really just going to explore this vulnerability, which just so happens to be SQL injection. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper into that, but before we do that, I want to pull up one of my nifty little illustrations here. So you'll see on the screen, we basically have a short diagram. So on the left here, we have our kind of our client machine. You can think of this as our VM that's sending, a bunch of different requests. And then on the right, we have this server that's processing the request. So this web server that's actually taking our input. Now, if we were to submit, something from this username field and this password, that's kind of step one here. So let's say if we typed in Jake and then in the password we typed in test and sent that to the server and hit that little login button, it would send some value of Jake and test as username and password. The second step is that the server then takes that data in, performs some logic, which is going to be the SQL, and we'll get to that in a minute, but let's focus on the high level. It's going to take that, process it in some way. Likely it's attempting to do some sort of lookup to say, hey, is there a user with the username of Jake and the password of test? And then it's saying yes or no. And that's really that third step. So it returns back to us, the client in this situation, a good, hey, you're logged in, or hey, I don't have a user named Jake or test. So let's just take the next step here and showcase what this actually looks like just from the UI here. So if we actually go ahead and we type in Jake and then we type in test for the password, let's see what happens. So we're not going to save that because that's obviously bad, but it looks like we just kind of get this, hey, that's not really what we're looking for. And if we opened up the, the dev tools here and looked at the network as we made that request, let's see if I can sneak in Jake and then test and hit enter so we can see. If we were to actually look at what happens in the background, we do send a request out to the web server with that information. So if we look at the request, you can see we sent the data Jake and test. So it's in the username, password. The response in this case was just sending us back the form because we did not get it correct. Now, the next process is going to be, what does this actual logic look like in the server? And if you were an attacker, how might you try to construct what this logic looks like? So, in that case, I want to take the second to look at what SQL is. So, while the server's trying to process all of this information, it's likely using this language called SQL or SQL, and that's just a structured query language, and it's just a technology for developers that allows them to attempt to look up information programmatically in their application, in their database where they're storing this information, like these users. So it's really just this way for a web application logic to interface with data that's being stored in a database. Now, if you can bear with my beautiful drawing skills here again, I'm going to do a short little illustration on what this actually might look like as we kind of, attack this and send this data. So in that second step, we're processing the user input when we send it either as, that Jake and then test as the password. So that SQL, we're going to basically build what might look like the actual SQL statement or the program or line of code that's attempting to look that up. So basically it might look like select star, which basically means select everything from users in this case, or a users table, that's the name of the table, and then it's going to add some conditionals like where username is equal to this user input and where this password might be equal to the password input that we provide. So it's ultimately doing this lookup on the user and the password. It's trying to compare these two values to see if a record exists. So I'm kind of, drawing it out here, just showing you that those two locations are the place in which the user input is going to end up. So hopefully you can kind of start to see what we're going to do. Now, the idea of SQL injection is that we want to manipulate this query, and I'm going to be drawing a little bit as I talk, but ultimately the goal here is that we can inject some name. So maybe like there's an admin user. So we're going to inject the name admin and then give it a single tick afterwards. So that's going to close off that quote. And you can see how when we enter that quote, it's actually going to cause the rest of that query that I'm scribbling out in red to become syntactically invalid, because there's just all this hanging, information here where none of this technically works anymore. So if we put in admin, I can actually do that here. That's what that would look like in our, actual UI, and that's what we would be sending through. But if we sent that through, it would cause some sort of error because none of the rest of the actual SQL statement ends up working. So one trick that we can do is actually add what's kind of called this, like comment character, and it depends on the type of database, but in this case, it's a pound sign. So when we enter that pound sign afterwards in the UI, that ends up commenting out the remainder of this query that I'm showing here. So the thing that we're left with is what I'm going to highlight. So we're left with select star from users where username is equal to admin, and then everything else is completely commented out. So what that's going to do is completely negate the check for the password. So we really don't even need any, data in this password. Now, in terms of the controls, it's going to make us enter a password, but realistically, what I want you to focus on is the idea that we're, terminating that string of where it's looking for that information, and we're basically negating the need to look up a password for the user admin. So if we go ahead and we send that through, we actually bypass the authentication and we're authenticated to this web application as the administrator user. Now, if you were actually doing the appointment box in the starting point machine, this would kind of be the end of the road here. And for the sake, again, of brevity, this is kind of where I'm going to stop, just in the idea of this authentication bypass and logging in as an admin user. What I want to kind of showcase, though, for anybody that's, inquisitive at home, is the ability for that SQL injection. Once we have the rest of the logic that is programmed by the developer of the application commented out, we now have control over that SQL statement or the lookup of the database. So realistically, it's not just this authentication bypass where we're logging in as an admin. We could use that actual SQL injection to potentially try to extract data from other tables in the database. Now, again, this is a simple example of, this only has like one table with users in it, so there's not other things to extract, but that same logic applies for taking this further. Potentially, we could escalate this into remote code execution and get arbitrary commands to execute on this machine, and that would be a way for us to take over this machine as a whole. And realistically, that led us from, nothing to start with to completely compromising this server just through this web application. And that's kind of the process of start to finish here. So that's what a penetration test might actually look like. Okay, so we just wrapped up what a small synopsis of a penetration test looks like. Before we kind of go back over and recap what we did, if you are interested in learning about, SQL injection at any length further than what we briefly covered in this, I think it's a great topic and a useful skill to have. Hack the Box Academy has an excellent module on SQL injection. I really encourage you to go through and, use that module because it's great. You can learn a lot about SQL injection. There's definitely more to cover on SQL injection than I could briefly in the 5-ish minutes that we could go over this. So I really think that's something that's worthwhile checking out. Additionally, if you are interested in the process of this penetration testing and you want to learn more, the CPTS exam offered by Hack the Box is essentially a more beefed up version of exactly this process. So it's a great way to expand upon your knowledge and learn more about how, different avenues of exploitation and analysis like this happen. So just to quickly recap everything that we went over, we started out with literally no knowledge of the target server other than the IP address. We started out in that enumeration phase of gathering information about that target and seeing what we could do, and that kind of bled into the analysis phase of seeing the information that we got back from enumerating the machine and seeing what paths we could take for potentially attacking it, and that ultimately leads into that last phase of exploitation, is identifying that path for an attack and then seeing how you can bypass either controls, compromise a server, so on and so forth. So it's really that path of enumeration, analysis, and exploitation. I hope that was useful for you all. I had a great time going through all this, but that's pretty much going to wrap it up for today's video, and I hope to catch you in the next one.